All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something that, on the surface, might seem pretty straightforward. But, as we'll see, it's way more complex than it first appears. So what exactly are we getting into?
Well, the big question is,
The big question we're trying to get to the bottom of is...
what defines an Aboriginal business in Australia?
You got it. And to really understand this, we're going to be looking at an excerpt from a paper
Oh, yeah.
by Dennis Foley. It's called Jus Sanguinis, The Root of Contention in Determining What is an Australian Aboriginal Business.
Catchy title.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful,
It really is.
but it gets right to the heart of the issue. Because you see, how we answer that question, what defines an Aboriginal business, it's not just some abstract academic debate.
Yeah.
It actually has real-world implications. We're talking policy decisions, economic opportunities,
Yeah.
even how these businesses see themselves and their place in the world.
Okay, so I'm hearing that this definition isn't just about semantics. It's about something much bigger. Absolutely. And to get a better grasp of why it matters so much, we need to start with a bit of context.
Okay, context is good. Where do we begin?
Well, let's think about the word business for a second. In the Aboriginal context, it can have a much broader meaning than what we might typically think of.
I see, like, not just the Western idea of a business.
Right. For example, you've probably heard the term sorry business.
Yeah, I've heard that term before. Yeah.
It refers to traditional mourning practices. So right there, you see how business is intertwined with these deep cultural and social
So
aspects.
it's not just about profits and spreadsheets.
Exactly. It's about community, connection, tradition.
So when we're talking about Aboriginal businesses in the context of this paper, it's essential to keep that broader perspective in mind.
Definitely. And that leads us to the importance of Aboriginal businesses themselves. They're playing a vital role in empowering these communities.
Okay, how so?
Well, they're creating jobs, generating wealth, which is huge.
Yeah, that's important for any community.
Exactly. But it goes even deeper than that. These businesses become a vehicle for self-determination. They give Aboriginal people a chance to control their own economic destinies.
It's about agency, having a say in your own future.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you can see why getting the definition of an Aboriginal business right is so crucial.
Right, because it affects so many things.
Yeah.
So how are they defined right now? Like, what's the current way of looking at it?
Well, there's a growing movement towards defining them based on majority Aboriginal ownership. So that means 51% or more.
51%. Okay. That makes sense on the surface. Seems pretty clear-cut. What's the reasoning behind that particular number, the 51%?
The main idea is to prevent non-Aboriginal businesses from just, slapping an Aboriginal label on themselves and profiting off of that identity.
So like cultural appropriation.
Exactly. It's about protecting authenticity and making sure that genuine Aboriginal businesses are the ones benefiting.
Yeah, that seems fair.
Because there have been some pretty egregious cases. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, they've actually had to step in and prosecute companies for things like selling Indonesian ornaments.
Wow.
And passing them off as authentic Aboriginal art.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There was even a case in Melbourne where a woman was forging paintings by a famous Aboriginal artist, trying to sell them as the real deal.
That's just wrong.
It is. So having that 51% rule, it's meant to be a safeguard against that kind of exploitation.
Okay, so I get why the 51% ownership seems appealing. It seems like a clear way to draw a line in the sand.
Right.
But I think you were about to say that this definition isn't quite so simple.
Yeah, it's not quite as black and white as it might seem. And Dennis Foley, in his paper, he really gets into some of the problems with this approach.
Problems like?
Well, he argues that, while it's well-intentioned, that 51% rule, it could end up excluding businesses that are legitimately Aboriginal-owned and making significant contributions to their communities.
So even though they're contributing, they might not technically qualify.
Right, and he gives this really interesting example.
Well, let's hear it.
It's a company called Ngarda Civil and Mining Alti Ltd. They're a large mining contractor.
Okay.
And they employ a lot of Aboriginal people. They work extensively with those communities.
So they seem like they fit the bill.
You'd think so, right? But their ownership is split 50-50
50-50.
between the Ngarda and Ngarli Yarndu Foundation and Indigenous Business Australia.
Oh, yeah.
So technically, they wouldn't meet that 51% threshold.
So they wouldn't be considered an Aboriginal business under that definition.
Exactly.
Even though they're clearly doing the work.
That's the point Foley's trying to make. It raises the question, is ownership percentage alone really the best way to measure this?
Right. Maybe there's more to it than just that one number.
And that's what another group, the Pilbara Aboriginal Contractors Association.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, PASCA for short.
For Tessier.
They're taking a different approach. They allow businesses to become members even with just 25% Aboriginal ownership.
Wow, that's a much lower bar.
It is, but there's a catch. To qualify, the business has to commit to hiring and training local Aboriginal people.
So they're emphasizing the actual impact on the community.
Exactly. It's about putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
It seems like they're saying, look, ownership matters, but so does your commitment to the community.
Right. And Passy, they make this interesting argument about how even smaller shareholdings can still have a big influence.
Like, how does that work?
Well, they compare it to the corporate world. They say, look, even if you own a tiny percentage of a company, if you rally enough other shareholders, you can actually trigger a takeover. You still have a voice, even if it's not the loudest one in the room.
So they're saying that even with 25% ownership, you can still steer the ship in the right direction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can still make a difference.
It sounds like there's some valid arguments on both sides here. You want to prevent businesses from exploiting Aboriginal culture, but you also don't want to be so strict that you exclude businesses that are truly making a positive impact.
It's a delicate balance for sure. And it gets even more complicated when we start looking at the different definitions used by various organizations.
Oh yeah, let's get into that. What are some of the variations we see out there?
Well, the Australian Taxation Office, or ATO, they define an Aboriginal business as at least one half Indigenous owned and managed.
Okay, so that's 50%.
Right. Then you've got the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS. They actually have two definitions. One is based on any Aboriginal ownership at all.
Any ownership, okay.
But the other one, which they use for smaller businesses, requires majority ownership and control. So that's more in line with that 51% rule.
Got it. So already we're seeing some different approaches.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there. The Indigenous Business Council of Australia, the IBCA.
Oh boy, this is a lot of acronyms.
I know, right? But the IBCA, they use the phrase majority owned, controlled, and managed.
Okay.
Which is similar to definitions used in the US and Canada.
Interesting.
And then finally, we have Supply Nation. That's the organization that certifies businesses as being Indigenous owned, which opens up a lot of opportunities like government contracts and things like that.
So they have a pretty important role.
They do. And they require at least 51% ownership by Indigenous Australians. But they also specify that the CEO has to be Indigenous and that the big decisions in the business are made by Indigenous folks.
So it's not just about who owns the most shares. It's about who's actually running the show.
Exactly. Control is a big part of their definition.
Okay, so, wow, that's a lot of different definitions. And it sounds like choosing one over another can have some serious consequences for businesses.
It definitely can. Some of these definitions are pretty broad, like that one from the ATO.
Right.
That one could potentially include businesses owned by, say, mixed-race couples. But others, like the IBCA and Supply Nation, they're much stricter.
They're really emphasizing that strong Aboriginal control.
They are. And it's interesting, you know, Supply Nation, they originally had a 50% ownership requirement.
Right.
But they bumped it up to 51%.
I'm thinking even stricter.
Yeah. So now it's actually more restrictive than the ABS definition for smaller businesses.
So you could have a business that's considered Aboriginal by one organization, but not by another.
That's exactly the problem. It creates this confusing and potentially unfair situation for businesses.
Right, because which definition are you supposed to follow?
Yeah, it's a real mess.
And I imagine this is particularly tricky when we're talking about businesses owned by mixed-race couples. Like, where do they fit into all of this?
That's a great point, and that's actually what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We've seen how complex this issue really is, but we're just getting started. Stay tuned, because we're about to unpack even more of this tangled web in the next part.
We'll see you there.
All right, we'll be back after a quick break.
Looking forward to it.
Before the break, you were talking about mixed-race couples.
Right.
And how these different definitions of an Aboriginal business might impact them.
Yeah, it's a really tricky area.
Can you walk us through that a little bit? Like, how do these definitions play out in those situations?
Okay, so picture this. You've got a business owned by a mixed-race couple, but only one partner identifies as Aboriginal.
So right away, you run into that ownership percentage issue.
You do.
What if their children identify as Aboriginal? Or say their non-Aboriginal partner is, really active in supporting Indigenous causes? Would their business still potentially be excluded?
That's the thing. If you stick rigidly to these ownership percentages, you could end up excluding couples like that.
And it seems like that would discourage those kinds of partnerships, which doesn't seem like a good thing.
No, it doesn't. Especially if you think about how those partnerships could actually help Aboriginal entrepreneurs.
Like by providing resources or connections.
Exactly. It's about overcoming those financial and social barriers that a lot of Aboriginal folks face when they're trying to start a business.
So pushing for those strict definitions might actually backfire in the long run.
It might. And here's another thing to consider. What about families where the income from the business is directly benefiting Aboriginal kids or family members?
Right. Even if the ownership structure on paper doesn't perfectly reflect that.
Exactly. So you could have a situation where the money is going to support Aboriginal folks, but because of a technicality, it wouldn't be considered an Aboriginal business.
It feels like we're getting caught up in the letter of the law and maybe missing the spirit of it.
I think that's a fair assessment.
It's about the impact, not just the paperwork, right?
Right. And I think that focus on narrow definitions might actually explain something else that Dennis Foley points out in his paper.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
There's a big discrepancy between the number of officially recognized Indigenous businesses and the number of potential Aboriginal businesses that are probably out there.
Wait, what do you mean?
Okay, so at the time Foley wrote his paper, Supply Nation, remember them?
Yeah, the certification organization.
They had only certified 198 Indigenous businesses.
198, that seems really low.
It does, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at the census data and you adjust for the fact that Indigenous populations are often undercounted, Foley estimates that there could be as many as 19,500 potential Aboriginal businesses out there.
Whoa, that's a huge difference.
It is, and that suggests that we might be missing out on recognizing and supporting thousands of businesses.
Just because they don't fit neatly into these predefined boxes?
That's the idea. And this whole conversation about defining Aboriginality based on percentages and ownership, it reminds me of another really problematic concept.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Blood quantum.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You know, that idea of measuring someone's indigeneity based on how much blood they have.
It's such a messed up way of looking at things.
It is. And it's really disturbing to hear terms like half-caste and full blood being used in these discussions.
They're so dehumanizing.
They are. And it just highlights how dangerous it can be to reduce someone's identity to fractions and percentages.
Like culture isn't math.
Right. It's so much more complex than that.
So, given all of this, all these complexities, is there a better way forward? Like, is there a way to define an Aboriginal business that actually makes sense, that's both inclusive and meaningful?
Well, Dennis Foley, in his paper, he proposes a definition that moves away from these strict ownership percentages.
Okay, and listening.
And instead, he tries to align it more closely with the legal definition of an Aboriginal Australian.
So more about self-identification.
Yeah. It's about recognizing who you are and how your community sees you.
That sounds promising. What does that look like in practice?
Well, his definition has three main parts. First, at least one person who owns part of the business, like a shareholder, has to identify as Aboriginal.
Makes sense.
Second, the business itself has to publicly identify as being Aboriginal owned.
So it's about how they present themselves to the world.
Exactly. And third, and this is important,
Okay.
the business has to be accepted as Aboriginal owned by the wider Aboriginal business community.
So like getting a stamp of approval from their peers?
Sort of. Foley mentions groups like the IBCA and Indigenous Chambers of Commerce as being those validating bodies.
So it's not just about ticking boxes on a form, it's about having that community recognition.
That's the key. It's about saying, yes, we see you, we recognize you as part of us.
I really like how that definition centers self-identification and acknowledges the importance of community.
That too. It feels much more aligned with how Aboriginal identity is actually lived and understood.
But of course, any system that relies on community recognition, there are going to be some potential issues.
Right.
What are some of the concerns people might have with this approach?
Well, one legitimate concern is that you might get businesses trying to falsely claim Aboriginal status.
Just to get access to certain benefits.
Exactly. Like maybe they think it'll help them win government contracts or something.
So how do you prevent that?
That's where the reputation and integrity of those validating organizations like the IBCA really come into play.
They have to be trustworthy gatekeepers.
They do. They have to have really high standards and carefully vet any business that comes to them seeking recognition.
So it sounds like finding a perfect definition is going to be an ongoing process.
It is. There's no easy answer here.
It's going to take a lot of open dialogue and careful consideration.
Yeah. We have to be willing to learn and adapt as we go.
This deep dive has definitely been a lot to absorb. What are some things you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
Well, I hope they'll realize that this issue of defining an Aboriginal business, it's not just some abstract debate. it has real-world consequences for people's lives.
It affects real people.
It does. And I hope our listeners will be inspired to learn more about this topic to form their own opinions.
To keep the conversation going.
Exactly. Because this is about more than just definitions. It's about understanding and supporting Aboriginal communities in meaningful ways.
Absolutely. Thanks for guiding us through this complex topic. It's been a real eye-opener.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that wraps up another Deep Dive. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. Until next time, keep those minds curious. This has been, wow, a really fascinating look at what it means to be an Aboriginal business in Australia. It's definitely more complicated than I think a lot of people realize.
It really is.
You've given us so much to think about, especially when it comes to finding a definition that, it really works for everyone.
It's a challenge, for sure. We have to balance the need to protect against exploitation with, wanting to encourage opportunities and recognizing all the different ways that Aboriginal people are already participating in the economy.
Because at the end of the day, if the goal is to empower those communities through business, shouldn't we be focusing on, the impact, the contribution of the business itself?
Absolutely.
Instead of getting hung up on these ownership percentages.
It's about more than just the numbers on a piece of paper.
It is. It's about, like you said, the human side of things.
Yeah.
How are these definitions actually affecting people's lives?
And I really hope our listener will think about that. Because this is a conversation that needs to continue.
It does. We've just scratched the surface here today.
We have.
There's so much more to explore. What other questions has this sparked for you? Keep digging into this topic. There's so many resources out there.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to, challenge your own assumptions. This is a journey, not a destination.
I like that. It's a journey.
It is.
Well, that wraps up another Deep Dive. Thanks so much for listening. We really appreciate you being here with us.
And thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.
And until next time, keep those minds curious. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.